I'd like to ask you, why, at the age of 40, did you start making films? And then the second question, why did you choose Joe McCarthy as your first topic?
Well, those are two entirely separate questions, so let me deal with question one first. I'd been basically uninterested in film because I saw film in my early life as essentially a commercial enterprise. Films were made to make money. Films were made to avoid the reality of life. Documentaries like Flaherty's Louisiana Story were fraudulent. They presented a false picture. And I saw no space for me in that world. And then the New York scene changed, and it changed film in a very precise anti-Hollywood way. And this began with a film that Jack Kerouac wrote called Pull My Daisy. It featured a great number of major artists like Robert Frank, the cinematographer, like Alfred Leslie, the painter, like a great actress, Delphine Seyrig, who went on to become a star in France, a great singer, Anita Ellis, and they were all in this film. It's very offbeat, made for very little money, and it's absolutely the quintessential expression of the Beat generation. And I thought, if these people can make a film for almost nothing, and it's one of the best films made, maybe it's time for me to look at what should be done.
Did you have background in film at that time?
I think most successful people in the arts begin in innocence. I had no background, which means that I had no garbage to get rid of, no detritus to get rid of. I mean, all that stuff that's taught in film school is simply taught so that you junk it at some point. And there was nothing I wanted from Hollywood except to junk what that had been. So I went directly to a thing that had never been done before in this country, which is I was able to buy from ABC the complete Army McCarthy hearings, 188 hours. Now, this was one of the great and most important political moments in American life, because when McCarthy began those hearings, when the government began the hearings with McCarthy in April of 1954, McCarthy was high. He was riding high. He was the most prominent and powerful figure in American politics. He had changed the nature of American politics. He had said, "You're a communist." And even if you were, as indeed he did, even if you were a cleaning woman in the State Department, and you didn't even know what the word communism meant, you were a communist because McCarthy called you one. And the word communist was used blatantly, without consideration, without judiciousness, without sensibility, to condemn all kinds of people, most of whom were not communists. By the time the hearings were over, and for the first time you had a hearing in which a demagogue like McCarthy was exposed to all of the American people. The audiences for those hearings were huge, bigger than World Series games, really huge audiences. And by the time the hearings were over, McCarthy was finished. He was no longer a political entity. Now, I wanted to take all that raw material, and it's not a question of editing or of reducing. It's a question of making something, of creating a structure, of making a film that had never been made before. I named it Point of Order because that phrase, those words were heard throughout America for months. Point of order, point of order. And all was disorder, of course. And that was the film.
Can I ask you this? Now, CBS and Edward R. Murrow's expose on McCarthy, did that come before or after your documentary?
Before, and it was thin stuff.
Right.
And don't forget, Murrow was on TV every week.
And
he waited until that end point to do his short, indecisive piece on McCarthy. His was a basically journalistic response, whereas mine was an attempt to do something else, which was to make art out of political raw material, to make a political art, which did not happen in this country. It was tried in the theater. Orson Welles did one of the first ones in the Great Depression, It was tried in the theater under WPA. Political art was made, but not film. And film was too dangerous because it reached too many people. So political films were not encouraged. Pseudo-political films were encouraged, like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, all those early classics. But films that were really about what is politics, who runs the country, how do they run it, to what end. I don't think that really happened until Point of Order.
What distinguished Point of Order from other documentaries in terms of style?
Well, the one thing that bothered me more than anything else, particularly about sleazy network documentaries, is that they always depended on some idiotic narrator, Cronkite, somebody who knew nothing about the subject, who would simply read off a teleprompter. I wanted to destroy that voice. I wanted the people who themselves were in the film to be the only voices heard. So I began Point of Order with my voice over Black Leader, and I say for 59 seconds, everything you were about to see actually happened. And I go on in that vein for 50 seconds more, and then I'm out, and there's no other voice heard except those people who really were part of that historical moment.
Obviously, you wanted to show his downfall, so you had to pick some moments in the hearings that would, in effect, show or reveal McCarthy unraveling. What moments do you think are most striking?
Well, I think the most emotional moment and the most dramatic moment, and the most dramatic and the most emotional are not necessarily the most political. But it's something that happened before the hearings began that then burst towards the end of the hearings. Roy Cohn, who was McCarthy's assistant, had a problem. He beat the draft. So they all agreed that Cohn's military record would never be mentioned. And just as the hearings were about to begin, Welsh, the famous Boston lawyer who opposed McCarthy, learned that a young man on his staff had been a member of a fairly communist organization when he was a young person at the Harvard Law School. It was the National Lawyers Guild. So they agreed that nothing would be mentioned about the National Lawyers Guild. Now, McCarthy was reckless. McCarthy could have really made something much wilder than he ever dreamed of, but he was so reckless, he destroyed himself right on TV because he brought up the name of that young lawyer. And at that point, Welsh began those great speeches that began, "Sir, have you at long last no sense of decency? At long last, no sense of decency." And the American people heard that, and they heard it unanimously, and the Senate heard it. And for the first time, the Senate, which had groveled and crawled before McCarthy, stood up and passed, even after the hearings were over, passed a motion of censure. It's what the Greeks called in their tragedy hubris, that overweening, irrational pride that brings you down, brings you to destruction. And this is precisely what it wasn't the good guys who brought him down. McCarthy brought himself down.
And who do you think the hero or heroes of the McCarthy Army hearings? Do you think it was Welsh, the senators, or perhaps television itself, really?
Doug, I wish you wouldn't give me the whole answer when you ask the question, because there's no doubt in my mind that it was the camera and the sound. It was television that was the hero. I mean, Welsh was a great lawyer and a highly sympathetic figure, but he too finally was a hired gun, as most great lawyers are. The more money you have in our society and any other society, I suppose, the better chance you have of hiring a great lawyer, which means a lawyer with a great fee, and beating the case. But what really destroyed McCarthy was that camera that's looking at me now, and which looked at McCarthy over a very long period of time. When you multiply the number of hours and the number of days from April through June of the year 1954, it was 188 hours that the American people looked at him. And nobody can hide in 188 hours. In 188 hours, if you're a good guy, it's revealed, no matter how clever you are or how much you want to hide even being a good guy. And if you're a bad guy, it's also revealed. and McCarthy was revealed, and the machine stripped him, and he was destroyed.
So you then chose to make a film about the Kennedy assassination as your second film. What led you into this project?
Well, Mark Lane and I together became involved in the film on Kennedy. Kennedy was a classmate of mine at Harvard. I don't feel sentimental about my classmates, but I thought that Kennedy was an important president, and I think he had an agenda that had to be stopped. And this is why we made the film, because we did not believe the Warren report, and we thought somebody other than Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or at least that if Lee Harvey Oswald had a role, it was a minor role. To begin with, Lee Harvey Oswald was a poor shot. In the second place, we now have so many facts and so much proof about other people who were in Dallas that day who had a real commitment to the killing of Kennedy. And then there's the political aspect of John F. Kennedy himself. Kennedy had alienated a good many people, although he didn't do very much, but he spoke, and he spoke very convincingly about changing things in regard to civil rights. This alienated a certain portion of the population, but most importantly, he alienated the CIA, because he did stop the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, and it is my belief that he was getting ready to pull out of our tiny, at that point, tiny presence in Vietnam. He had already withdrawn 1,000 troops, and he didn't think the war was winnable, and so he wasn't essentially an idealist, but a pragmatist. And pragmatic people are generally wiser than ideologues, like the right-wing lunatics who wanted the war in Vietnam. And so he had to be killed, just as his brother had to be killed.
The most striking thing in looking at the film today is the amount of witnesses that you compiled interviews with who claimed that they saw gunshots or heard gunshots or gun smoke or movements in this grassy knoll on this fence, which was very close to the passage on the freeway where Kennedy drove past. Witness after witness confirmed that they think that that's where the gunshot came from. How were you able to get these people on film, and why didn't the Warren Commission go after them to the extent that you did?
What the Warren report and commission failed to do makes you feel not only that it was flawed, but that there must have been something else afoot, because we found witnesses, simple Texas working people, honest people who had no axe to grind, who were on top of the overpass. Kennedy was being driven down toward them. They saw what happened as well as anybody. There were 5 of them there. The Warren Commission interviewed S.M. Holland first. He was the foreman of these 5 people. And his testimony was so amazing, in which he said he believed that shots came from the grassy knoll, did not come from the book depository building, that there was more than one shooter, that there were not 3 shots but 4 shots. The Warren Commission did not want that testimony, so it took a little bit of the next man and none of the other 3. Nobody ever asked, who the hell was Ruby? Why was Ruby, who was a pimp, who ran a cheap nightclub, who was a drug dealer, why did he feel that it was his patriotic duty to kill Oswald? And then when Earl Warren came with other members of the Warren report and they talked to Ruby in his cell, Ruby said, "Mr. Chief Justice, take me out of this cell, take me to Washington and I'll tell you the truth." This clearly implied he had not told the truth. And then Ruby died of cancer 6 months later. Now, doesn't it seem reasonable to think that somebody put Ruby up? I mean, this is an assumption that had to be examined. I'm not saying it's the truth, but it had to be examined and weighed carefully and considered. Isn't it at least reasonably possible that Jack Ruby was said by one of his bosses, "Look, you've got terminal cancer. Go in and kill this son of a bitch, and you'll be comfortable in jail, and you'll die, and you're going to die anyway." I mean, something like that. Maybe he said it more kindly than I've put it, but it could have been something like that. It was something the Warren Report, had it been efficient and honest, would have brought up, questioned, weighed, and then thrown out if they could prove it was not. They left too many strings lying around. Now, the other thing, can you believe this? Could anybody in his right mind believe this? That all the material they took in the interviews with Oswald, Chief Fritz, Chief Investigative Officer of the Dallas Police, Chief Curry, the chief in charge of the whole police department, they had no notes, no record of any notes. Now here you're interrogating, if he's guilty, the most important criminal in modern times, the most important criminal since the assassination of Lincoln at any rate. And they don't keep any notes? I mean, you know, that isn't feasible. I mean, it makes the whole... See, any place where you touch the Warren Report, or what the police did, wherever you touch it with a probing finger, you knock it out. I mean, could anybody believe, ask any honest cop, ask any military policeman, ask anybody who's ever run a courts-martial or a judge who's run a trial, that if police have interrogated a guy for 8 hours and who has killed the President of the United States,
right,
there'd be no notes? Those two people should have been fired. Instead, they stayed on the force until they retired.
The main point of your film, Rush to Judgment, was to raise questions concerning the Warren Commission's theory that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. You punctured many different holes in this theory, but you didn't really offer an alternative hypothesis. At this point in time, many years later, do you have some ideas about who you think might have been involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Well, this is probably better informed than the Warren Report was, but I never pursued it. I never did a lot of work on it because I went on to make other films. I mean, I covered what I had to cover in the film Rush to Judgment, but right. I'm convinced that it was a combination of Cubans and CIA people. Cubans under the direction of CIA people. Cuban veterans of the Bay of Pigs.
The Cuban exiles, not
Cuban exiles,
not
Cubans living in Cuba today or then, but the same exiles who attempted to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs operation, which Kennedy halted, you know. Those people believe to this day that if he had put up the B-26s and bombed the beaches, and if he had used more naval cover, that they would have won. And it was at the last minute that he called off the B-26 strikes. And those people hated John F. Kennedy with a passion, and they hate him to this day, even though he's dead. And it's absolutely my belief that they, with the CIA officers who ran them together, were responsible for the death of Kennedy.
Do you think the mob had any role? Jack Ruby obviously had mob connections. He seemed to be part of a conspiracy plot.
Well, I hope you don't think this is a light joke, but it's my feeling you have enough people at the ball without the mafia. I mean, it's possible that the mafia was involved, and it's possible that the mafia may even supplied weapons or something, but you have too many people there, and most of the evidence that points, there's a woman that Lane found long after we made the film who had been the mistress of Castro and then became an anti-Castro person and was involved with the Cuban community. And she talks of making a trip to Dallas with a Cuban guy who was involved with the CIA, even in Watergate. And Lane says before the court, and he won this case, by the way, Lane did, what was in the car besides you people? And he said, she said, oh, the trunk was full of high-powered rifles.
That was Marita Lorenz, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's, you know, why didn't I mean, if Lane could find that person, yeah. Why, I mean, you know, if a civil lawyer can find that person, where was the FBI? Where were the investigators in the Warren Commission?
Lane also alleged that E. Howard Hunt, who later turned up in Watergate and who had involvement with CIA and these right-wing Cubans, was also present in Dallas that day.
That's absolutely true. So was Richard Nixon present in Dallas that day, but nobody thinks he had anything to do with the death of Kennedy. That's something quite different. But Howard Hunt was there,
right.
And Howard Hunt had lied about that,
right.
And he lied in court about it. And this case ended only 3 years ago.
Well, didn't Marita Lorenz say that the caravan carrying rifles that she was in was met in Dallas by Hunt, and he was the one who received them and then paid them off?
She did say that. But that was in Spotlight.
Right.
And Spotlight is not a paper, is not the New York Times. I mean, I try to be as conservative as possible, which is why I didn't bring that up. You brought it up, which I'm glad you did, because I frankly believe it. But, you know, it doesn't have the same evidentiary weight that the New York Times has, or the fact that Hunt lost a case in which he lied about where he was. It's one of the great mysteries. And the Warren Commission that belongs to the garbage can of history, and so does the Warren Report. And what will go on is, you know, more and more people die, so there's less and less evidence. But people will go on asking that question as long as people ask questions.
Let's talk about your next film, In the Year of the Pig, which was about the Vietnam War, and you made it while the war was still going on.
Well, I'm not only a leftist, I'm an American patriot. And it's very possible to be a leftist and to be a patriot and love your country. And that is a position I take. I thought our war was immoral. And so did many other people. And finally, the majority of the American people came to that belief. But after all, I'm an artist, I make films, and I wanted to make a film that would treat history. I didn't want to make an over-emotional film. I didn't want to make a piece of Hollywood nonsense like Platoon, or, I mean, they came after me anyway, but I wanted to make a film that would place Vietnam in history, beginning with the French history, which is where I began it. And a little allusion to the Japanese invasion of Vietnam while we were in the war with Japan. And then our war, primarily our war, and what it was that our war was about, why we were there. And as usual, I use a collage method in which many voices, many faces, many images are used. And that was the first left-wing film nominated for an Academy Award. It was not widely played here because it was very badly treated here. When it opened in Los Angeles, somebody broke into the theater and wrote the word traitor on the wall. I was the traitor. Well, that's bad for business. You know, nobody goes to a film. The booker, the people, all the theaters canceled it. And in Texas, when it was supposed to open at Houston, there were bomb threats. So then the university in Houston was going to play it, and then there were more threats. And then the YMHA in Houston actually played it. There's a big difference economically, critically, and in every other way from a theater to the YMHA.
What's the YMHA?
Young Men's Hebrew Association, like the YMCA, except Hebrew rather than Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Neither Christian nor Hebrew has any particular meaning for me. I'm a non-believer. But I thought it was very brave of the YMHA to do it. But it's not the kind of audience I would have had in a theater. But I never complained about it, and I'm not complaining about it now. If you make hard films that oppose the government, you can't expect the government to hand you a lollipop or give you a tax deduction. I was audited every year. I mean, I was audited every year because of what I did. I might as well have been a drug smuggler or in the mafia or something, because the film did uncommonly well in Europe. You know, but I wasn't proud of that. The French loved my film, and they loved it for two reasons. A, France does have film culture, and they're wild about films that have new forms, and it played in 3 theaters in Paris at once and got great reviews. But they also liked it because they had lost the war in Vietnam, and we were still fighting it, and they said, ha ha, the Americans are fighting it. So they enjoyed. And I was uncomfortable with that, by that, of course, because I am an American and not a French person.
I think in The Year of the Pig is probably the densest and richest collection of images of any documentary film that's ever been made. There's probably never been so many images before put together in a film. Where did you find all of this material, and what led you to assemble it in the way you did?
Well, I knew I could get all the film in the West, so I began by going to Paris and meeting with the Vietnamese, and they gave me one film, which was a film made by them called The Life of Ho Chi Minh, which was important, and I used quite a bit of that footage. I then went to Prague, where the National Liberation Front was, and got material from Prague. I then went back to France and got French material from the French experience in Vietnam, and I went to East Germany, which has one of the best film archives in the world, and got the Soviet material that the Soviets wouldn't give me, namely the Soviet director Karman's reconstruction of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Then I came back to this country and got all of the American footage I wanted by paying $3,000 a minute for it.
Ooh.
And then I shot a lot of material, and the shot material is the most important part of the film, because I shot a deserter from the Green Berets. I shot the only man who I knew or that anybody else knew in the United States who spoke not only Vietnamese but Cham, and who was a professor, and a French professor who taught at Yale, and who taught Buddhism and the history of Vietnam. And he was a brilliant man who became a friend of mine. He's dead now. But I also then found American footage of, obviously, of Johnson and McNamara and their lives, and protesters. The one young boy, one young man I liked and admired was a 19-year-old who was a sergeant in the Green Berets and who was deserting. And I helped him to desert. He moved to Sweden. He still lives there.
Of all the rich images and critical images of that film, which ones do you think best capture the nature of the American involvement in Vietnam? Do you have some favorite scenes or images?
Well, I think that scene of all those naval weapons being fired, I mean, those monstrous, it begins with that was the most desperate war this country ever fought, because the people who fought that war were as badly treated as we treated the Vietnamese, almost. I mean, you know, anybody who wanted to get out of the draft who was white could get out of it. It was a war in which there was an out-of-proportion number of blacks, of poor whites. If you were going to college, you got out of it. So there was a class war, in a sense. I mean, the poor people who couldn't afford to go to college went into the draft and went to Vietnam and were killed. And the people at Harvard, where I went to school, went to graduate school. After being at Harvard for the full 4 years, they then would go to law school or medical school and add 3 more years, and by that time they were out of it. A young man who was associate producer, and the reason I wanted him to be associate producer of my last film, Mr. Hoover and I, was somebody who avoided the draft and went to prison. He made a principled stand against the draft, and he went to prison. And his name is Michael Thomas, and he's a good friend of mine.
Dee, I found the faces of those American generals the most striking. And you filled the screen with these close-ups of Curtis LeMay and other Americans. Mark Clark, who were making the most brutal and racist statements imaginable about how the Orientals don't value life, and about how they should be bombed back to the Stone Age, and other horribly brutal remarks. What's the significance of their faces filling up the image of the screen?
Well, to begin with, I'd like to say that General LeMay was my own commanding officer. But the point of that is
that was during World War II, when you flew B-29s.
Yeah. Ooh, we don't talk about that.
No, so people wonder about what LeMay was being doing.
LeMay was my commanding officer, right. And he did say bomb them back to the Stone Ages. There's a barbarism in that you don't find among civilized people. The thing that I cannot forgive my government is that it never went back. When we finished our war with the Nazis and the Japanese, the very first thing we did with the two richest and most powerful countries in their own areas was immediately help to build them back. We poured billions of dollars into Germany and Japan. And when we were done with the Vietnam War, of course it was because we lost it rather than winning it, But what we left was a legacy of more bombs that were unexploded that still kill people. You see, there's a kind of cruelty in our view, in our policy to Vietnam that extends all these years after the war. It's sheer cruelty. I mean, we took the Nazis and we helped rebuild Germany. And of course, maybe because they're yellow people, because they're Asian.
Or because we lost that war.
Or because
we can't admit that we made a terrible,
and we don't admit we lost
mistake.
it. We always say we withdrew from it. But we withdrew because we lost it. You don't withdraw if you're winning.
Right.
I mean, you were a naval officer, you know that. If you're winning, the other people withdraw. You stay. And
well, a big difference is not only did we lose it, but they were a socialist country, whereas the German and Japanese were capitalist countries that we built.
They were a communist country, in fact.
Movie about Richard Nixon was really, really, one for the jugular vein, but funny, a whole lot of different things roll up into one.
Well, the proper title is what I meant it to be. Most people just call it Milhouse. And I misspell his middle name intentionally. Right. I spell it like the German word that his middle name came from, which was Mühlhausen. The other great man whose family came from Mühlhausen was Albert Schweitzer. But the name of the film is Milhouse, a white comedy. Mm-hmm. Because to me, Nixon was the quintessential white comedian in a sort of perverse sense. And I think that was the first time anybody did the life of a president on film. And it's a full-length biography. It's a 97-minute biography on film that goes back to his earliest days and up until just before Watergate.
But it's not a conventional biography in the sense that you tell a linear story. It's rather like your Vietnam film, a collage of images that capture Nixon through the juxtaposition of images and a very complicated image construction.
Well, first of all, I don't see film as being linear to begin with. Mm-hmm. To me, it's essentially much more disjunctive, much more episodic, and I intentionally made Nixon's life that way. I mean, one of the themes I ran, Nixon was always nervous about who he was, always nervous. And he wrote a book himself. He had somebody else write it, but I mean, his name is on the book as the author, and they're his ideas, surely. It's a book called Six Crises, and it's an attempt at his autobiography. And it's almost biblical or religious in tone, because here he has these terrible crises, and he overcomes them. He surmounts the problem, and then he goes on and upward until he becomes the president. Well, so many of those crises were flawed, I mean, one of the first is the Hiss case. Now, Nixon's entire career depended on what happened to Alger Hiss, because Nixon was an unknown congressperson. And he suddenly introduced the Hiss case into the House. And it's a long story, but Alger Hiss eventually went to jail, and Nixon's career was made. And somebody who began in the Congress in the year 1946 as the most junior congressperson there, by 1952 was chosen by Eisenhower to run as the vice presidential candidate. And it was because of the Hiss case. The Hiss case gave him a kind of publicity that no congressperson of his generation had. Day after day, the Hiss case played before the American people in the different courts, in the courts of appeal, in the Congress of the United States. And Nixon played it like a master.
Dee, some people say that Alger Hiss represented really Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and a certain sophisticated internationalist cosmopolitan mentality that people like Richard Nixon and later Joseph McCarthy would oppose. So that by knocking Hiss off, the right wing was showing that it could deal with the New Deal, that it was superior. Do you think there was something on that there was a power struggle going on between liberals and conservatives, and that Hiss and Nixon were just on different sides of this battle at that time?
That's a very long question, Doug. There's no doubt that the right-wing radicals wanted to shoot down Roosevelt, and shoot down, for instance, Yalta. And Hiss was part of the team at Yalta. He was a State Department person who went to, one of the State Department people who went to Yalta. And the fact that he went to Yalta, I assume, had something to do with the reason that he was the one who was triggered. In a sense, the contract was put out on him. It's clear from the evidence that's come out since that time that most of it was fairly phony. And finally, the most ridiculous thing of all, as I say in Mr. Hoover and I, is the fact that it was found, all the evidence was found, the microfilm was found in a pumpkin.
Right.
I mean, who ever heard of anything as crazy as that, you know? I mean, here everybody's looking for this vital evidence, and it's found in a pumpkin in a farm in New Jersey. It's not really credible, you know.
In effect, Nixon was a McCarthyite before McCarthy. The McCarthyism, so to speak, began with Nixon going after Hiss. I mean, didn't McCarthy then start going after the State Department to get so-called communists out and begin his crusade? So there's a real linkage between McCarthy and Nixon here.
There always was until Nixon became vice president. And then he had to assume a different role because McCarthy was a self-destruct kind of person, and Nixon was a very careful, precise, ambitious man who would have done anything, and he did it. But he also knew when to be quiet, and when he became the vice president, and then when the hearings began 2 years after that, Nixon cut himself off from McCarthy. Nixon was always prudent. Some might say that Nixon had no moral scruples, frankly, that he did what he had to do. But if you look at it in a kindly way, which I don't, you could say he was a pragmatist, that he indeed did what had to be done to further his career.
Oh, yes, there was all this big talk in the 1960 election about the new Nixon. You know, he's different from the way he used to be. He's more of a statesman now. I saw one columnist say, there is no Nixon. Nixon was this back during the Red Scare days. He's trying to act like a statesman now. Nixon is whatever is necessary at any particular time.
The most pathetic thing about Nixon is the one time he tried to be a good guy, he really got screwed.
What was that?
In the 1960 campaign, that was as tight as any election ever was. And now it's fairly clear that there is no doubt that the state of Illinois was the swing vote. And the state of Illinois was swung by voting many dead people.
All of whom voted for Kennedy.
All of whom voted for Kennedy. And the people on Nixon's staff and important members of the Congress said to Nixon, start a lawsuit. And Nixon said, no, it would be bad for the country. Let's let it go. It was so tight anyway that Nixon wasn't sure he was going to win. But actually, as you know, if they proved only a few hundred dead people voted, then there'd be enough of a scandal so that the whole country would have been flawed at that moment as a result of that suit. So,
but Nixon did make his remarkable comeback. It looked like he was completely out of politics. Your Milhouse film has that famous sequence where he talks to the reporters in California after losing the governor.
You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore,
right.
He says. He says he's never going to run again, you know.
Right.
He says, publish it, do what you want. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. I won't be here. But you know, from that minute on, he was starting to run again.
Right.
I mean, Nixon never told the truth. And his second attempt was brilliant because nobody in the world gave him a chance. And you have to admire that stick-to-itiveness in Nixon. I despise the man, I despise his policies, but that toughness, and he's still that way. Even after Watergate, you know, he is still having people write books defending the entire position of his administration. I mean, you can suddenly think you can forget Gordon Liddy and all those crooks and thieves who were in the White House and all that money piling in there. The plumbers, the Cubans, but Nixon is there. I think there are 4 books now by Nixon, not written by him really, but with his name down as the writer since Watergate in 1974. He's a tough guy, and you know, you can't help but admire that. As I say, I despise him, but I also admire that never quitting.
Milhouse came out during the end of Nixon's first term before he ran again for re-election in 1972. How did the Nixon administration and the public receive your film, Milhouse? There wasn't a very flattering portrait of Richard Nixon.
Well, it was meant to be an absolutely punishing and cruel portrait of a man who himself punished and was cruel. Nobody has found an error in that film. I mean, everything that's in there is true. But it was a huge theatrical success, and then it was killed, of course, because I was already accustomed to that. The government killed the film.
How'd they do that?
Well, the government doesn't do it officially, but it opened in New York in 3 main theaters at one time, the first documentary ever. It was in the Plaza and another theater on 58th Street and in the New Yorker. All of these are big theaters. The New Yorker had 900 seats. And they were filled. And the New York ran. But when it went out to the West Coast, it went into 50 theaters. It was supposed to go into 50 theaters, and they all canceled. And that's the way hardball is played, and Nixon played hardball. And the manager of the Bluebird Theater in Denver wrote me a long letter in which he said, we were going to play your film, Milhouse, a White Comedy. And then we were told by the people who own our corporation that we would not play it because the film did not give Nixon equal time. To finish with Milhouse, with the Milhouse story, Nixon had me put on the enemies list.
Right.
And that wasn't such a light thing, because it meant you were audited. I was already being audited anyway. But I was on the enemies list, and the enemies list was not a big bunch of people. It was people Nixon regarded as real enemies. And to me, it was a badge of honor, of course, and I still keep it as a badge of honor. I always have a few Xeroxes of the enemies list in the drawer of my desk, and I like to look at them. I mean, that's the most sincere form of film criticism, when the President of the United States takes time out to cut you off. I mean, that's real. You know that your work has a kind of dimension that Elizabeth Taylor films don't have.
After Milhouse, what was your next film project, and what were you feeling about film at that time, having all these films suppressed? Wasn't it discouraging? Or?
Well, I made a film whose title came from Robert Frost, called America's Hard to See.
Oh.
And that was about the Chicago, basically about the 1968 Chicago Convention and the fix and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. And it ends with a great speech, I can say it because it's not my speech, by Arthur Miller, who says something to the effect that what we learned in 1968 is that the people don't own anything. The politicians do, and the people who own the politicians. They own the Democratic National Convention, they own who's going to be elected, who's going to be nominated, and all the rest of it. That was a film made in anger and made very quickly. And then I went on to make, then I went on to finish Painter's Painting, which I'd begun.
You did a film on the Weather Underground, which was really unique. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it was unique, but most of the people in the Weather Underground, one of the sad things you find if you've lived among radicals, as I have, and I'm a radical, is they don't come from the lower class. You would think that the lower class, which was treated punitively, would be the class that would, but in our society, for instance, the Weather Underground, who made the strongest protest as the Vietnam War started to wind down, were essentially from the upper classes or the middle classes. And these people did a tremendous number of bombings in which they tried never to hurt anybody. But they put a bomb in the State Department. They bombed police stations. They bombed my brother-in-law, who was a CIA person.
Gracious.
And they bombed his office. They bombed all kinds of people who were or not people, they didn't bomb people, they bombed all kinds of installations which stood for military power, which stood for the war in Vietnam, which stood for injustice. And the FBI went crazy because they couldn't find these people. The FBI had hundreds of people full-time looking for these guys and women. There were as many women, it was already a feminist group, there were as many women in it as men. And so I thought, why not? Why don't I do this film? Why don't I go underground and show the FBI how it's done?
And you had to find them, of course.
It wasn't hard. Not for me. I mean, it was hard for Jed, for the FBI, but not for me. I just took a friend of mine aside and said, listen, you know where those people are. Put me in touch with them. So it began like a mystery story. It was wonderful because he said, about a week later he came by and he said, okay, go to the Mayflower Hotel. That's 59th Street. It's right where Central Park is. And yes. He said, go to the third phone booth from the left at exactly 7 o'clock, and the phone will ring. So I went in there, and the phone rang. And a disguised voice said, De Antonio? I said, yeah. The man said, you will get a message from us which will tell you what the next step is. So the next step was that I was to go on the subway, which I never take, to be on the last train, to get on the train, then jump off quickly, and then make sure that the train left the station, obviously, and get on the train after that, and take it to a certain station in Brooklyn, hell of a long ride, and there'd be a phone booth on the northwest corner, go to the phone booth, and at exactly 7 o'clock the phone would ring. The phone rang, I said, okay, now walk. And I ended up, and I thought the guy who did this had military training, because it's like a great field of fire, you know, except this time it's vision. Because I was standing in a corner and I was visible from there, and in a huge arc. And I was supposed to stand 5 minutes. I stood 5 minutes, and out of the darkness came this young guy, and he smiled and said, D. And then he gave me his fake name, shook hands, and he said, go over there. There's a woman holding a copy of Time magazine against her chest, like this, and I did. Was so involved, and we went into a restaurant and sat and talked. And they said, now, why do you want to make this film? And da-da-dum-da-dum. And we finally agreed. And then I got Haskell Wexler, and they went to a safe house in California, and we went to the safe house and filmed them and made the film. And the FBI went bananas. And as a result, we were subpoenaed. Now, the First Amendment of the Constitution is the dearest thing in all law to me. That is that we as Americans have the right to feel, think, write, film anything we want. So I enjoyed testing the First Amendment. We got 3 great lawyers, and the entire Hollywood community supported us. We stood there with our lawyers, and I read my statement, which said, I believe I have the right to make any film I want. To me, that's as clear an expression as there is of the First Amendment in regard to film. And behind us stood Martin Sheen and Warren Beatty and the head of the Screen Directors Guild and 50 well-known actors and the American Civil Liberties Union, and the FBI withdrew everything. And we won, and we were the first people in the history of film to win. And that year I got the award of the American Civil Liberties Union for defense of the First Amendment. And I'm glad we did it, and it's a good film. And it doesn't advocate bombing, because I make films, not bombs. Those people bombed. My film gets treatment that other films don't. When that film, I noticed that the Germans bought it. They bought it for a hell of a lot of money, a tremendous amount of money. I thought, this is going to be great. They're going to play it on every station. Instead, they bought it to suppress it.
Oh.
They bought it on a 7-year contract, and they never played it. And a young German radical who's writing a book about me found out about all of this. And he wrote a big story that was published in every German newspaper, so that we got revenge down to the last bone.
Did the FBI step up its activities and surveillance of you after that?
Yes, they tried to break into my house. And then, you know, there are always good people. This is a great and complex country. 2 two young lawyers in the Justice Department wrote me letters, they signed the same letter, wrote a letter saying, we're resigning from the Justice Department because of what it does to people. And you were among the people and they said the FBI tried to break into your house.
Wow.
The FBI did this and this and this, and these are the people who were involved, and here are the documents.
Oh my God.
So it was pretty great stuff, and I never went public with that because I didn't want to hurt them, in spite of the fact they said they didn't care. But, and you notice I haven't mentioned their names, which I remember very well, but...
was this the time where you got your Freedom of Information Act information on the extent of FBI surveillance of you? When did that come about?
Then. And, you know, that film alone generated 10,000 documents. I mean, it's not just 10,000 my whole life. That one film generated 10,000 documents because, as I say in Mr. Hoover and I, an ex-FBI man came to see me and he said, you know why you don't even have the numbers for your files on the Weather Underground film? I said, no. He said, because you're listed under Bernadine Dorn. You see, because she was one of the leading Weather Underground people. So what they would do is they would put my file under her file. So when I say, do you have a file on me concerning my Weather Underground film, they could say no.
Oh.
This isn't much freedom or much information in this sort of...
No, that's the whole point. And, it was very, very funny. I mean, you know, you wanted to go and shoot them, but at the same time you had to realize it was funny. I mean, you know, these people are supposed to represent law and order, and they stand for suppression and disorder. The charter of the FBI is a reasonable charter. The charter of the FBI is to go after criminals, is to prevent crime across state lines, like bootleggers, bank robbers, etc. But it's not in the Constitution to be used to keep people from making films or writing books or having ideas. The next film I made was called In the King of Prussia. And I'm an atheist, but I've always admired Daniel and Philip Berrigan because they were brave, and because of what they did.
They were priests, right?
They're priests. One is a Jesuit, and one was resigned from the priesthood and is married, has children, and runs a house in the middle of the Black District of Baltimore where anybody is welcome to stay or be fed. So they had decided to attack a thermonuclear nose cone at the General Electric plant in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. And they did this, and I made a film about it. And Martin Sheen heard about it, and I knew him anyway, but he said, Dee, I want to be in the film. I'll play any part you want me to play. And I said, well, Martin, I'd like you to be the judge. He's the bad guy. And he said, oh, I'd love to do that. I'll be the judge. So Martin is the judge. But not only was the judge, he said, it must cost a lot of money to make that film. I said, well, that's my problem. It does. He said, well, let me give you some. So instead of paying him to act in the film, he sent me a check for $10,000. And that film, the films changed people's lives. That film changed Martin's life. Oh. Because Martin has now been arrested 7 or 8 times in demonstrations. And he's now connected with Mitch Snyder and the homeless movement in Washington. And his own children think he's bananas, you know, because he goes out and does, he's middle-aged now, he's 48 or 9. He goes out and does all this stuff and gets arrested. And
he hadn't been active until that movie he was in here?
No. So you politicized him?
I've politicized a lot of people.
The establishment and the ruling class in this country are very much on the right track from their point of view of suppressing as much of your stuff as possible, because you do politicize and radicalize people.
That's my intention, after all, isn't it? I mean, I don't make these films as an academic exercise.
But radicalize, all you do really is show what really is happening, what the truth, and truth is reality.
But the truth is radical.
Yeah.
The truth is always radical.
Reality is radical.
Reality is radical is absolutely correct, because if we knew, if the American people, I believe enough in America and the American people to feel that if they knew what was really going on, say, in Nicaragua, not this blather that Dan Rather puts out, blather rather, but you know what really is happening there, there'd be a sense of outrage about it. But we've already brainwashed on that subject.
This is why your work is so radical and subversive, because the official version of reality, whether it's the Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam War, Nixon, Nicaragua, is lies. It's distortions. So if you counter that with the truth, you're coming off as a radical, subversive. You're subverting the official account.
I'm very self-destructive. The most useful person to me in all the world is Vincent Canby of the New York Times. He's their chief film critic. He gave Milhouse a review that guaranteed it a hit. It would be a hit in New York. But I attacked him anyway, and it finished my getting a review from the New York Times. But I attacked him on the question of actually El Salvador. And I ended my letter by saying to him, not only am I right and are you wrong, but I challenge you to have the entire staff of the New York Times go over any of my work and find one place where I've tampered with history. Go find one, and then you can write about it and call me a liar. And he could not find one. I mean, there are always tricks in film, but there's, I mean, there are cuts that are a little faster than they should be, or something else perhaps, but there's nothing as cooked in my work as was cooked in the work of the United States government during this whole period on any one of the subjects I addressed. Then I went on to finish Painter's Painting, which I had begun. And Painter's Painting is a film about people who were friends of mine, and political people never liked the film because it was a celebration of New York painting. It starred Bill de Kooning and Andy Warhol and Jasper Johns and Frank Stella and Robert Rauschenberg and a great many painters and people in the art world of New York. And this had never been done before. You know, just think of what it would have been like to have lived in Paris and have a camera crew and film Braque and Matisse and Picasso. And that's exactly the way New York was, say, from 1949, 1950, to the time I filmed them in 1970, and on past 1970, but I mean, I was there, and I knew those people well. I knew Rauschenberg and Johns before they ever sold a painting. A woman I used to live with gave Warhol his first job. I knew these people extremely well. I met Frank Stella when he was still a student at Princeton. And I knew de Kooning from long before, and Barnett Newman. And most of my political friends hate that art, and they hate the fact that these people have all made millions and millions of dollars. I mean, millions. Those people make more than bank presidents do, and they're not even crooks. So that I think that nobody makes as much money in America today, including movie stars, than Jasper Johns. He probably makes, I know that he sells about 10 paintings a year for $800,000 each. And then he sells some of his older paintings for a lot of money.
To your other work, how do you see it in relation to your political films?
Well, what I always said I was doing with my films, once I got a few of them made, was to try to put on film the history of my time that interested me. And the painting of my time interests me, and it's not political. The very world around painting is essentially a reactionary world. It's a world of many millionaires getting their kicks by buying paintings. It's a series of sharp dealers, of hokey museums, but it's also done by people who came from all sorts of classes. Most of the painters I knew came from the poor, and they're now super millionaires. And I don't care about the money, you know. I mean, even though I own some of their works, I don't care about the money. I like the work. It's, and as I told you before, I'm a patriot. You know, American art was really strong and new and vital and interesting. And painting has always been for the rich. In the Middle Ages, it was the church that was rich. You don't think that peasants commissioned art in the 12th century. It was cardinals and popes, kings and lords. Painting, anything that's tactile. You see, the beauty about film is that its very nature should be democratic, that anybody can go into a theater and look at it. The beauty of the written word is almost the same thing. Even though books cost $20 today, it's not really that serious. But if you want to buy a major Jasper Johns work that's old, you're going to have to lay out $10 million. And that immediately takes most people out of the market.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. Maybe the people who buy those paintings are bad, but the people who make them are not.
Political art in the United States that people have made a lot of money on, like when you go down to Mexico, wow, you see these incredible political murals, and you realize what's missing in the United States. Is art that carefully controlled to keep out the political art in the United States?
Well, let's put it this way. We've never had an artist of quality who tried to do political art. I mean, Ben Shahn was not art of quality. And Jack Levine is not an art of quality. The Germans have produced political art, modern German art. There's a guy called Hans Haacke who is quite amazing. He's attacked Margaret Thatcher. He's attacked Reagan. And he's done it brilliantly.
I've seen Swedish political art, too.
And I've spent a lot of time in Sweden and seen Swedish political art, but it's not as good as German. There is one man now who's doing serious political art who's a success, but it's a minority because, frankly, what can be owned? You can't own a film, basically, except a cassette. And you can't own a book in the sense that you own the rights of it. But when you own a painting, you own the entire thing. Nobody can reproduce it without your permission. It's yours, and there's a kind of ownership. And it transcends the concept of bourgeois society, because it goes back, as I say, to lordly societies and religious societies. The greatest collections of old art in the world were by the popes. You can still go to Rome and see not just Michelangelo's chapel, but see one painting after another.
The ruling class have always controlled art as a sign of their temporal power.
Absolutely.
And it continues to this day. It's the big corporations that buy most of the modern art for their corporate buildings or donate them to the Museum of Modern Art and the major museums around the country and get healthy tax deductions and all. Painting has to do with money. There's no doubt about that.
Tell us about your film, Mr. Hoover and I. That's really takes courage in this day and age to attack the FBI directly.
I believe enough in this country so that I don't think it takes courage to attack the FBI. I've been attacking it all the time, but I wanted to I wanted to do something that had never been done before. I wanted to tell my life story and do it in terms of Mr. Hoover, the head of the FBI, and his interest in me, which began when I was 16 years old, and to make a film that would reflect the bounce and the heat that existed between the FBI and me from that time to the present.
At 16 years of age? He was after...
Well, I mean, he had every right to have a small interest in me because I was a precocious person, and I entered Harvard at 16, which was fairly young to begin with, and then I joined 3 radical groups. I joined the Young Communist League. I joined the John Reed Society. John Reed was a Harvard graduate who covered the Russian Revolution and changed. And I joined the American Student Union, which was like SDS was in the 60s, but that was a long time before. And I think that the FBI should have taken a file out on me and then realized that it was nonsense because I didn't do anything, basically. I mean, I wasn't old enough. I wasn't political enough. I did it to find out. I mean, I went to demonstrations, but there was nothing too crazy. I mean,
but this was the 1930s when the country was in a Great Depression.
Oh, yes.
When there were hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, militant union
and we were getting ready to go to war with Hitler, a war in which I enlisted, but that's something else. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But the FBI, you see, the real problem is that the FBI has always been a secret police force. As I said before, the FBI does have a charter, which is to go after criminals, but it doesn't have any charter to go after to do thought control, or to care what organizations I belong to. If those organizations break the law, or if I break the law, then the FBI should come after me. But those organizations did not break the law, and neither did I.
What's the significance of Hoover for you?
Well, Hoover is the quintessential lying, cold warrior bureaucrat all of those things are evil. He's one of the truly most evil people that our society has produced. To me, one of the most wildest things was that Hoover even attacked gay people. When he himself was gay, and nobody ever had the courage to say this, he lived with Clyde Tolson as man and wife for 30 of the years that he ran the FBI. And if somebody applied to the FBI and was gay, he would be rejected because he was queer. I mean, you know, it's a kind of theory of royalty that the king can do no wrong. King John Edgar and his wife, Clyde, and his queen, Clyde, can do no wrong. But anybody else, bingo. Now, to me, that is simply outrageous.
In effect, you compiled some files on J. Edgar Hoover in your film. You exposed Hoover to public scrutiny in the same way that he used to like to expose people.
Except I can't hurt anybody. Right, and what I was exposing was the truth.
Right.
And not secret files. Those secret files were really, really crazy because they were so complete. I mean, I enlisted to be a flyer. And when I was in flying school,
this is World War II.
World War II. Right. He corrupted people. He had people, I don't know what made them do it. He did it with military intelligence, reporting on what I was doing all the time while I was in the Air Force. And there I was flying expensive equipment, and these people were reporting. They had nothing to report, because I'm not an idiot. I never talked Marxism in the Air Force. I mean, besides I wanted to be in it and all that. And I was the only thing I did that he didn't even care about, only the local police cared about, I was the wing commander of my class. You see, this drove the FBI crazy, too. And two other aviation cadets and I, and we were getting ready to graduate. We were in Texas. And that time, the Rice Hotel, which is nothing now, was the best hotel in Houston. This was many years ago, 1943. We rented a big suite, and we got drunk. And I used to have a knife, and I took the knife and split open the pillows, and all the feathers came out. And they didn't have air conditioning those days. They had fans. So I had the fans going with the feathers flying, and I said, "Snow room, this is the snow room." And we kept drinking, and feathers flying. That was a really serious offense, because the Houston Police Department came and they said, "Come on, we're going to have to take you off to jail." And the manager said, "You don't have to take them to jail. It'll affect their careers. All you have to do is pay for it." So we paid for the damage and got off. But I mean, that was the real crime of my military career.
There are also scenes in this movie of your friend John Cage baking bread, speaking about his philosophy of creativity, and your wife Nancy giving you a haircut. What are the significance of these sections of the film interspersed with the more explicitly?
Well, I consider the John Edgar Hoover elements non-human, and the other elements are the human elements.
I see.
My wife does cut my hair because she does in real life.
Right.
I can't stand going to barbers. I don't know why. I mean, maybe my brother, who's a psychiatrist, could tell me, or my wife, who's a psychoanalyst, could tell me. But I can't stand having some guy want to put smelly stuff in my hair. And, you know, like everything that John says, it sounds so simple, so naive, and it's profound. You know, I wanted to be an artist. I didn't know which way to go, and he just said... And we've maintained this relationship over many, many years. And he's politically radical in that he thinks that Thoreau was the greatest American. Thoreau, who went to prison for one day rather than pay than pay his tax for an unjust war, the Mexican War.
This raises an interesting point about your film work as a whole. Many people see you as a political filmmaker, making the documentaries, the political, historical...
I am a political filmmaker.
Right, but in addition, you're an artistic filmmaker. In other words, art and politics...
No, that's one thing. I'm an artist who makes political films.
Okay, so that's the way you would see yourself.
Yeah.
This is sometimes neglected in analyses of your work. People fail to see the radical innovations you've made in the documentary film. Your use of it for artistic statements, visions, your use of...
Well, look at even Mr. Hoover and I. Nobody's made a film like that. Right. I mean, I can't say that I don't think it's that original, but the fact that nobody else did it must mean that it's somewhat original. I mean, I made a film about myself. I'm not a particularly good actor, and I'm the main actor in the film. And it's not easy to talk for 89 minutes. And my voice is just about the only voice in that film, except for a few words of Nancy's and of John's. And I know the film works, as I've only shown it about 4 times, because I don't even have a final release print or release prints. All I have are 2 answer prints, which are not correct. And it played here, and you know how people applauded. It was remarkable. And the same thing has happened every time it's played. And people have to reinvent themselves all the time. And a country has to be reinvented all the time. And the idea of liberty has to be fought for and reinvented all the time. And it's exactly what we should be doing instead of being repressive. Instead of having an FBI that wonders what you read or what I say or whom you go out with, it should worry about who is breaking the laws, the real laws that should not be broken. And we should be making a new kind of life in this country that isn't for the rich, because most of the people in this country aren't the rich. This is not a world of George Bushes. This is not a sleazy world of the Reagans. I mean, this is a world of many kinds of people, of different colors and races, of different national backgrounds, all in one place. And it seems to me that it devolves on us to be experimental, to be radical, to be open, to seek justice, to risk our lives for the truth. And we're not doing that. And nobody's ever done that.
Well, Dee, you have done it. I think you just gave...
No country's ever done it.
Oh, no country, but individuals within this country. I think you just gave a remarkable statement of what your life's work.
No, I'm also a hypocrite and a liar, and you know, come on, I'm a human being, so I'm full of error. But the collective people of this country interest me more than I'm interested in myself, and that may sound like a lie, but it isn't. I mean, the idea of living in a country that would change that way. I mean, I think that Thomas Jefferson, in spite of the... You can't blame Jefferson for his acts and thoughts, which were natural in his time. But I think that people like Jefferson and Lincoln and Tom Paine in particular, and a good many other Americans, have stood for something that all the world admired. And one of the things that rankles us now is that nobody admires us. Because we have nothing to hold up. I mean, to really, can one imagine that people would admire a country ruled by Ronald Reagan and his wife? It seems to me unbelievable, not credible. And I think, you know, I think one of the points of all my work is it's directed to change and at changing the country. And getting young people in particular to believe that it's possible to do tremendous things, things that require daring, and to make a new world. I mean, this place was called the New World. We're now an old world, you know. We have lost our ingenuity as well, even in the business world that I don't care that much about. But we were the New World, and we are now, in every sense, the old countries. Germany, Japan, countries long before there was the United States, are the New World. There are even more new ideas in Germany now. And so that's why I make films.
You also, it seems to me, have done quite a bit of reinventing documentary. I'm struck by how different your films are. Every single film you seem to approach from a new angle. There's always some innovative features in it. So I think, as well as this political aim of telling the truth and exposing the lies and dealing with the hard and controversial issues, you really have attempted to innovate the documentary film, to develop it in new directions, to make formal contributions to the film. And it's this intersection of art and politics that I see as defining your work as a whole. And I think they're related, because art can be emancipatory. The notion of formal innovation, of invention, of openness, of creativity, of doing something new is an analog to political change. It's the same process.
I agree with you. I think that, I mean, I think this is what my work tries to be. And there's no point in giving a speech like the one I just gave, and making it and saying this is a film, because it isn't. I mean, a film is something else. If we were to, we could make a film doing this with the TV cameras. We would have to rethink the whole thing and change the form around. And it's a very heavy problem, say, to change the very nature of an interview. I'm looking into Lisa's camera, and so I'm in this static position. So the only thing I can hope for is to say something that's different, or else pull out a clown's hat and wear it, or something else. But I do think that we always have to test. I mean, that really is what the game is about. Okay, what you're saying is absolutely correct, and I'm rambling, because I mean, I could never stand to make the same film over, which is why I could never work in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. In Hollywood, if you make a really successful picture that brings in a $50 million profit, you have that guy with the claws, number 4. Number 5, what is he? The guy that scratches, kills the women. Oh,
Freddie or
Freddie.
Something.
I mean, those things are not inventive. They're not new. They're not exciting, and they're dead. And we have to look for a new art. And that's why I liked painting, frankly, because it was an individual enterprise. And a painter could paint not because he had to change it, but because he had no alternative, and not because there was any demand in the market. I mean, the painters were honest in that sense. They weren't changing the way a tailor would change fashion in clothing. And that's why one of the reasons I was intrigued with the painters. I found so many people on the left sterile when it came to ideas about what art should be, or film should be, or poetry should be. They were back at some other place that had already been explored and finished, dug up. The evacuation was there, and all that was ready was a coffin. Needed was a coffin, a tombstone.
Ultimately, why did you choose then documentary as your media of choice? You started off more interested in art, really. You were very involved in the art scene. Why was it that documentary rather than fictional film or painting or any number of other movies?
Well, first, I loved the document. I loved, and the second, and equally important, is frankly money. Is that you could make a work that was reasonable in price. My stuff isn't that cheap, actually. When you put them all together, I've spent a few $1 million. But that's for 10 films. Whereas a $2 million film in Hollywood is not much. I mean, not having to raise a lot of money or have a lot of money is freedom. It's a way to make films, or to make a work of art that isn't produced by an accountant and was surrounded by 3 lawyers.
Do you have any projects coming up now? Are you working on anything?
Well, the enthusiasm of other people and in myself for this new film leads me to think that I should make another film. And I'd like to make a film about something. I'd like to make a film about some women. I don't know who they are, but I'd like to make a film about women to see if I could really understand what women think that I don't think, because I'm not a woman. And it would be political, too. And one of the things I've liked about my work in the past is that I've hired so many women and got them in a position where they could leave, which is what I always wanted them to do, so they could go and make their own work. I like to hire people who had no experience, because then they wouldn't have bad ideas. And some of them went on to become phenomenally successful. And some settled for children and marriage. And, life is composed of choice. I don't like one more than the other. I mean, they were all like children to me, in a sense. So Are there more questions? Or?
No, that's it. I want to thank you very much.
So we come to the end.
We come to the end.
Thank you so much for coming to Austin. We showed all
I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. This was, this was a great reception and tremendous people, and it's not bullshit. And, the response on the campus was terrific, and I feel I'm among friends here. So.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete.
Dangerous because it reached too many people. So political films were not encouraged. Pseudo-political films were encouraged, like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, all those early classics. But films that were really about what is politics, who runs the country, how do they run it, to what end, I don't think that really happened until Point of Order.
What distinguished Point of Order from other documentaries in terms of style?
Well, the one thing that bothered me more than anything else, particularly about sleazy network documentaries, is that they always depended on some idiotic narrator, cronk-eyed, somebody who knew nothing about the subject, who would simply read off a teleprompter. I wanted to destroy that voice. I wanted the people who themselves were in the film to be the only voices heard. So I began Point of Order with my voice over Black Leader, and I say for 59 seconds, everything you were about to see actually happened. And I go on in that vein for 50 seconds more, and then I'm out, and there's no other voice heard except those people who really were part of that historical moment.
Obviously, you wanted to show his downfall, so you had to pick some moments in the hearings that would, in effect, show or reveal McCarthy unraveling. What moments do you think are most striking?
Well, I think the most emotional moment and the most dramatic moment, and the most dramatic and the most emotional are not necessarily the most political. But it's something that happened before the hearings began that then burst towards the end of the hearings. Roy Cohn, who was McCarthy's assistant, had a problem. He beat the draft. So they all agreed that Cohn's military record would never be mentioned. And just as the hearings were about to begin, Welsh, the famous Boston lawyer who opposed McCarthy, learned that a young man on his staff had been a member of a fairly communist organization when he was a young person at the Harvard Law School. It was the National Lawyers Guild. So they agreed that nothing would be mentioned about the National Lawyers Guild. Now, McCarthy was reckless. McCarthy could have really made something much wilder than he ever dreamed of, but he was so reckless, he destroyed himself right in 1954. McCarthy was high. He was riding high. He was the most prominent and powerful figure in American politics. He had changed the nature of American politics. He had said, "You're a communist." And even if you were, as indeed he did, even if you were a cleaning woman in the State Department, and you didn't even know what the word communism meant, you were a communist because McCarthy called you one. And the word communist was used blatantly, without consideration, without judiciousness, without sensibility, to condemn all kinds of people, most of whom were not communists. By the time the hearings were over, and for the first time you had a hearing in which a demagogue like McCarthy was exposed to all of the American people. The audiences for those hearings were huge, bigger than World Series games, really huge audiences. And by the time the hearings were over, McCarthy was finished. He was no longer a political entity. Now, I wanted to take all that raw material, and it's not a question of editing or of reducing. It's a question of making something, of creating a structure, of making a film that had never been made before. I named it Point of Order because that phrase, those words were heard throughout America for months. Point of order, point of order. and all was disorder, of course. And that was the film.
Can I ask you this? Now, CBS and Edward R. Murrow's expose on McCarthy, did that come before or after your documentary?
Before, and it was thin stuff.
Right.
And don't forget, Murrow was on TV every week.
And
he waited until that end point to do his short, indecisive piece on McCarthy. His was a basically journalistic response, whereas mine was an attempt to do something else, which was to make art out of political raw material, to make a political art, which did not happen in this country. It was tried in the theater. Orson Welles did one of the first ones. In the Great Depression, it was tried in the theater under WPA. Political art was made, but not film. And film was too dangerous.
I'd like to ask you, why, at the age of 40, did you start making films? And then the second question, why did you choose Joe McCarthy as your first topic?
Well, those are two entirely separate questions, so
Right.
let me deal with question one first. I'd been basically uninterested in film because I saw film in my early life as essentially a commercial enterprise. Films were made to make money. Films were made to avoid the reality of life. Documentaries like Flaherty's Louisiana Story were fraudulent. They presented a false picture. And I saw no space for me in that world. And then the New York scene changed, and it changed film in a very precise anti-Hollywood way. And this began with a film that Jack Kerouac wrote called Pull My Daisy. It featured a great number of major artists like Robert Frank, the cinematographer, like Alfred Leslie, the painter, like a great actress, Delphine Seyrig, who went on to become a star in France, a great singer, Anita Ellis, and they were all in this film. It's very offbeat, made for very little money, and it's absolutely the quintessential expression of the Beat Generation. And I thought, if these people can make a film for almost nothing, and it's one of the best films made, maybe it's time for me to look at what should be done.
Did you have background in film at that time?
I think most successful people in the arts begin in innocence. I had no background, which means that I had no garbage to get rid of, no detritus to get rid of. I mean, all that stuff that's taught in film school is simply taught so that you junk it at some point. And there was nothing I wanted from Hollywood except to junk what that had been. So I went directly to a thing that had never been done before in this country, which is I was able to buy from ABC the complete Army McCarthy hearings, 188 hours. Now, this was one of the great and most important political moments in American life, because when McCarthy began those hearings, when the government began the hearings with McCarthy, in April of, well, Mark Lane and I together became involved in the film on Kennedy. Kennedy was a classmate of mine at Harvard. I don't feel sentimental about my classmates, but I thought that Kennedy was an important president, and I think he had an agenda that had to be stopped. And this is why we made the film, because we did not believe the Warren Report, and we thought somebody other than Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or at least that if Lee Harvey Oswald had a role, it was a minor role. To begin with, Lee Harvey Oswald was a poor shot. In the second place, we now have so many facts and so much proof about other people who were in Dallas that day who had a real commitment to the killing of Kennedy. And then there's the political aspect of John F. Kennedy himself. Kennedy had alienated a good many people, although he didn't do very much, but he spoke, and he spoke very convincingly about changing things in regard to civil rights. This alienated a certain portion of the population, but most importantly, he alienated the CIA, because he did stop the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, and it is my belief that he was getting ready to pull out of our tiny, at that point, tiny presence in Vietnam. He had already withdrawn 1,000 troops, and he didn't think the war was winnable. And so he wasn't essentially an idealist, but a pragmatist. And pragmatic people are generally wiser than ideologues, like the right-wing lunatics who wanted the war in Vietnam. And so he had to be killed, just as his brother had to be killed.
The most striking thing in looking at the film today is the amount of witnesses that you compiled interviews with who claimed that they saw gunshots or heard gunshots or gun smoke or movements in this grassy knoll and this fence, which was very close to the passage on the freeway where Kennedy drove past. Witness after witness confirmed that they think that that's where the gunshot came from. How were you able to get these people on film, and why didn't the Warren Commission go after him to the extent that...
On TV, because he brought up the name of that young lawyer. And at that point, Welsh began those great speeches that began, "Sir, have you at long last no sense of decency? At long last, no sense of decency." And the American people heard that, and they heard it unanimously, and the Senate heard it. And for the first time, the Senate, which had groveled and crawled before McCarthy, stood up and passed, even after the hearings were over, passed a motion of censure. It's what the Greeks called in their tragedy hubris, that overweening, irrational pride that brings you down, brings you to destruction. And this is precisely what it wasn't the good guys who brought him down. McCarthy brought himself down.
And who do you think the hero or heroes of the McCarthy Army hearings? Do you think it was Welsh, the senators, or perhaps television itself, really?
Doug, I wish you wouldn't give me the whole answer when you ask the question, because there's no doubt in my mind that it was the camera and the sound. It was television that was the hero. I mean, Welsh was a great lawyer and a highly sympathetic figure, but he too finally was a hired gun, as most great lawyers are. The more money you have in our society, and any other society, I suppose, the better chance you have of hiring a great lawyer, which means a lawyer with a great fee, and beating the case. But what really destroyed McCarthy was that camera that's looking at me now, and which looked at McCarthy over a very long period of time. When you multiply the number of hours and the number of days from April through June of the year 1954, it was 188 hours that the American people looked at him. And nobody can hide in 188 hours. In 188 hours, if you're a good guy, it's revealed, no matter how clever you are or how much you want to hide even being a good guy. And if you're a bad guy, it's also revealed. And McCarthy was revealed, and the machine stripped him, and he was destroyed.
So you then chose to make a film about the Kennedy assassination as your second film. What led you into this project?